Dad, we think it's time.
That's how Denton phrased it. He sounded as if the family had come together at a kitchen table and reached this conclusion in a thoughtful way, considering the man sitting in front of him. But none of it had been thoughtful. None of it had been caring. Aldous Fairweather stared at his son from across the dining room table in the house he built himself in 1987, not metaphorically, not in some poetic sense, but literally, nail by nail, beam by beam, on land he bought after 7 years of saving. He observed Denton's careful expression, Suki's hands resting in her lap, and Britta's gaze, which was purposefully unfocused, looking past his shoulder. In that moment, he realized something with the clarity that comes to men who have spent a lifetime measuring precisely. They had already made their decision. This wasn't a discussion. This was a notification. Time for what, exactly? Aldous asked. Denton started explaining. He talked about the assisted living facility, the financial issues, the house being too much for one person, and the family's concern for his safety and comfort. He used the word "we" 11 times in 4 minutes. He never once asked Aldous what he wanted. Aldous listened closely. He nodded at certain points. He didn't interrupt. When Denton finished, Aldous picked up his coffee cup, took a slow sip, and set it back down. "I'll need some time to think about it," he said. Denton smiled, believing the hard part was over. He had no idea it hadn't begun yet. "Let's go back. What you just witnessed wasn't the start of this story. It was the moment Aldous Fairweather chose to finish it. Some men don't talk much about their work. It's not that they're modest. They just believe their work speaks for itself. Aldous Fairweather was that kind of man. He spent 40 years building infrastructure that people drove over, walked across, and lived beneath without ever thinking about the quiet engineer who calculated every load, every stress point, every safety margin. He built 3 major highway bridges in the southeast. He oversaw the restoration of a century-old railway viaduct in Pennsylvania that engineers twice his senior labeled unfixable. He spent the last 11 years of his career at a state university, teaching structural engineering with the patience of someone who understood that the difference between a bridge that holds and one that fails is often a small number applied incorrectly. He retired at 68. By then, his wife, Lorraine, was already unwell, not dangerously, at first, just a slow build-up of small issues that sometimes emerge in one's 70s. They had plans to travel. Portugal was on the list, along with New Zealand and a river cruise in France that Lorraine had gathered brochures for since 1998. They made it to Portugal. That was their one trip. Lorraine passed away at 70, suddenly and without much warning, due to a heart problem that her doctor later said had likely been brewing for years. Aldous sat in the hospital hallway for 4 hours before anyone came to find him. He drove home alone. In the kitchen of the house he built, he didn't cry, not because he didn't feel it, but because the grief was too overwhelming, and he needed to breathe first. 3 days later, he cried alone in the garden she had planted, on a Tuesday afternoon. That moment was private. That moment was his. The children came for the funeral and stayed for a week. Denton took charge, as he always did, efficiently, thoroughly, with the demeanor of someone managing a project instead of mourning his mother. Britta cooked, cried, and called her friends from the back porch. Suki moved quietly through the house, observing everything. Aldous noticed Suki watching. He noted it and said nothing. After the week, they all went home. Aldous stayed in the house he built, in the town where he had lived for 35 years, surrounded by neighbors who brought casseroles, friends who visited for coffee, the garden needing care, and the workshop in the back where he still built furniture on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, giving it away to those in need. He was not lost. He was not helpless. He was a 71-year-old man who had just lost his wife and was learning, with the same careful patience he applied to everything in his life, how to adjust to her absence. The calls from Denton started 6 months after the funeral. At first, they were weekly, then more frequent, changing in tone, not the calls of a son checking on his father, but the calls of someone gathering information. "How are you managing the bills, Dad? Have you thought about yard maintenance, Dad? That roof is getting old, isn't it, Dad? Aldous answered every question truthfully and noted the pattern they created. He was an engineer. He understood load-bearing structures. He recognized exactly what it meant when someone began to carefully test the weaknesses in a foundation. He opened a new notebook and wrote the date at the top of the first page. He would not let himself be manipulated by his children. He planned to be much more difficult than that. The dining room conversation, the one where Denton said, "We think it's time," took place 14 months after Lorraine's funeral. By then, Aldous had been watching for 11 of those 14 months. He had a very detailed notebook. He noticed Denton positioning himself as the family's decision-maker, quietly and efficiently, like someone installing infrastructure before anyone realizes it's happening. The weekly calls had turned into a web of conversations, Denton talking to Britta, Britta reflecting Denton's language back to Aldous, Suki asking careful questions about the house's maintenance costs during holidays, Denton mentioning several times that the property was significant and complex to manage for a man living alone. The property. His home. 35 years in one place reduced to a management problem. Aldous also caught sight of what he wasn't supposed to notice. How Denton's eyes scanned rooms during visits. The half-heard conversation from the upstairs hallway during Thanksgiving, Suki's voice, low and precise, "The lot alone is worth considerably more than what he paid." And with that addition he put in, "and then a door closed." He wrote that down in the notebook too. What Denton wanted, Aldous concluded, was the house. Not right away, Denton was too careful for that. What he wanted was control of the situation, which would gradually lead to control of the asset. The assisted living facility was just the first step. Once Aldous was comfortably settled and managed, the house would be framed, by Denton, in Suki's careful language, as a burden, an expense, a liability that the family would reluctantly agree needed to be sold. The proceeds would flow into an estate account that Denton, as the eldest child and an attorney, would manage. Aldous recognized it was a reasonably well-constructed plan if you were dealing with an elderly man who was confused, isolated, or had lost the habit of standing up for himself. Denton had misjudged on all three counts. The week after the dining room conversation, Aldous drove 40 minutes to the next county and entered the offices of McBride Elder Law. He found Caroline McBride after his doctor recommended her. The doctor described her as the kind of attorney who does not lose. He sat across from her and shared everything, the calls, the Thanksgiving discussion, the dining room meeting, the patterns in the notebook. He placed the notebook on her desk. She read for 12 minutes without saying a word. Then she looked up. "Mr. Fairweather," she said, "you have done my job for me. This is exactly the documentation I would have asked you to compile." "I'm an engineer," he replied. "I document things." She almost smiled. "Your son will file for guardianship, likely within 60 days after you refuse the assisted living proposal. I've seen this before. He'll claim diminished capacity, isolation, and an inability to manage affairs. Can he win?" "Not if we act first," Caroline said. "And not once a court sees what I'm looking at." So they acted first. Aldous also called Nolan Voss. They had been friends for 43 years since a neighborhood cookout in 1981. They spent 3 hours cheerfully arguing about baseball and found they agreed on almost everything else. Nolan had been an investigative journalist for 30 years before retiring. He developed a keen sense of attention, capturing not just what was said but also the shape of what was left unsaid. "Tell me everything," Nolan said when Aldous finished. "From the beginning." Aldous shared everything. Nolan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Denton doesn't know I still have contacts at 3 newspapers and a regional television station." "No," Aldous replied. "He doesn't know that." "Good," said Nolan. "Let's keep it that way for now. Subscribe to Gray Hair Stories and hit like because the engineer is now drawing his own blueprints. What would you have done in Aldous's position? Would you have confronted your children immediately or handled it the way he did? Tell me in the comments. Denton filed the guardianship petition 44 days after their conversation in the dining room. Caroline had predicted 60 days. When she called Aldous with the news, she noted that Denton was more impatient than she had expected. This was useful information. Impatient people tend to make mistakes. The petition claimed Aldous Fairweather, age 74, showed signs of cognitive decline, social isolation, and an inability to manage his finances without help. It included a letter from a physician, not Aldous's regular doctor, who had seen him monthly for 8 years and would have laughed at the suggestion, but a geriatric specialist who evaluated Aldous once, for 40 minutes, at Denton's suggestion 4 months earlier. Aldous attended that appointment, thinking it was a routine wellness check that Denton had helpfully scheduled. He wrote the name of the doctor in his notebook when he got home. He noted, 40 minutes, 1 visit, Denton's arrangement. Caroline filed the response within 72 hours. It was 41 pages long. It included 8 years of medical records from Aldous' actual doctor, showing consistent cognitive clarity. Financial statements demonstrated that the estate was in excellent shape, with all bills current and investments managed wisely. The notebook contained detailed records spanning 11 months, including dates, times, and exact quotations. There was also a signed statement from 6 neighbors, 3 university colleagues, and the pastor of the church Aldous had attended for 20 years. Finally, there was a professional cognitive assessment by a neuropsychologist of Caroline's choosing, completed 10 days after Denton's petition, showing Aldous scored in the top 15% of his age group on every measure. And one additional item Caroline specifically requested after talking with Nolan. A recording. Nolan suggested it 3 weeks before the petition was filed when they both anticipated it was coming. He reminded Aldous that in their state, single-party consent made it legal to record a conversation to which you were a participant. He lent Aldous a small but excellent recorder from his journalism days. Aldous used it during the conversation in the dining room. He also recorded 2 subsequent phone calls where Denton's language was much less careful than it had been face-to-face. In those calls, Denton talked about the house's market value, the complications of Aldous' situation, and the need for the family to protect its interests. Whose interests were not specified. But the recordings were clear. The judge assigned to the case reviewed Caroline's response and scheduled a hearing 3 weeks later. She also issued a temporary order preventing any changes to Aldous' living arrangements or financial accounts during the proceedings. Denton called Aldous the evening after the temporary order was served. He wasn't using his courtroom voice but a different one, tighter, higher, stripped of its usual professional tone. "Dad. You hired an attorney." "I did," Aldous replied. "This isn't necessary. We were trying to help you." "The court will determine that," Aldous said. "I trust the process." A long silence followed. "Dad." "Good night, Denton," Aldous said, and hung up. He sat for a while in his living room. The house he built. The one they tried to take from him. He looked at the walls he framed, the floors he laid, and the fireplace he mortared himself over 3 weekends in the autumn of 1989, when Denton, then 11, helped carry bricks with the pride of a boy given a real task. He thought about that boy and grieved for him briefly and honestly. Then he went to bed, knowing he had a hearing in 3 weeks. He intended to be well rested for it. Subscribe to Gray Hair Stories. You do not want to miss what happens in that courtroom. Hit subscribe right now. When Denton called after the legal response, what would you have said to him? Be honest in the comments. What does a parent say to a child who has done this? The courtroom was not large. It was a family court hearing room, wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, and the specific acoustic flatness of a space designed to absorb arguments and create resolutions. Aldous sat beside Caroline at one table while Denton and his attorney sat at the other. Britta was in the gallery, 3rd row, and she couldn't look at her father directly. That told Aldous everything he needed to know about her feelings in all of this. Suki was absent. Caroline noted this with interest. The judge was 60, straightforward, wearing reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, only removing them to look at witnesses with full attention. She had reviewed Caroline's 41-page response. Her expression, when she glanced at Denton's attorney, was not friendly. Denton's attorney presented the petition. He was competent, Aldous recognized competence, but he was working with weak material. The specialist's assessment looked less like a professional opinion and more like a handy document for someone. The allegations of financial mismanagement fell apart against the account statements. The claim of social isolation crumbled against 12 signed statements from people who saw Aldous regularly and considered him among the most engaged in their community. Caroline presented her response with the ease of someone who has made this argument before and never needed to make it twice. Then she played the recordings. The courtroom fell silent as the recordings played. The judge's reading glasses came off. She listened to Denton's voice discussing the house's market value, the complications of the situation, and the need to protect the family's interests. She listened to Suki's voice from the Thanksgiving hallway, captured on Aldous' phone which had been legally in his shirt pocket. The lot alone is worth considerably more than what he paid. When the recordings ended, the judge looked at Denton for a long moment. Denton's attorney mentioned some context. The judge raised one hand. "Mr. Fairweather," she said, momentarily addressing both Fairweathers. Then she clarified, "Denton. Your father's cognitive assessment, conducted by a board-certified neuropsychologist, places him in the top 15% of his age group on every measure. His finances are in order. He has an active social life, a continuing community presence, and 8 years of medical records that describe a man in sound health. The physician whose assessment supports your petition evaluated your father once, for 40 minutes, at your arrangement. She paused. I'm dismissing this petition. But she was not finished. I am also referring the conduct documented in these recordings to the State Bar for review of Mr. Denton Fairweather's actions. This raises questions outside the scope of this proceeding but within professional ethics oversight. She looked directly at him. Elder financial abuse is a serious matter in this state. I encourage you to consult your own attorney. The room was silent. Denton's face changed several times. It settled into a pale, shocked expression, the face of a man watching the structure he built collapse beneath him. In the third row, Britta was crying. Not the kind of crying that tries to maintain appearances. This was the real kind. The kind that comes from realizing, too late, what you have been involved in. Aldous stared at his daughter for a long time. He didn't look away until she did. Outside the courthouse, on the steps, Nolan was waiting. He had his phone out. The bar referral is public record, Nolan said. I've already made 3 calls. The Tribune wants a comment. The television station is interested in the elder financial abuse angle. This will be a story whether Denton cooperates or not. I'm not interested in destroying him, Aldous said. I know, Nolan replied. But you might want to make sure this doesn't happen to the next man. The next man who doesn't have a lawyer, a notebook, and 43 years of a friend who used to cover the courts. Aldous was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light was long and golden on the courthouse steps. He thought about bridges. He thought about the unseen calculations that keep things steady. Let them run the story, he said. Tell the truth. That's all. Subscribe to Gray Hair Stories, hit like, and leave a comment because justice just walked out of that courtroom on its own 2 feet. When the judge made her ruling, what were you feeling? What do you think Britta should do next? Tell me everything in the comments. The story ran on a Thursday. Nolan wrote it himself, not because the Tribune required it, but because he understood everything, and because some stories need someone close enough to feel their weight. He didn't use Aldous's name. He had offered, but Aldous refused. Not to protect Denton, but because Aldous didn't want to be a public figure. He wanted to go home. The story was titled, When Family Becomes the Threat. It described the pattern, the fake concern, the arranged assessment, the guardianship petition, the recordings, the bar referral. It quoted Caroline McBride, who spoke at length about what she called one of the most documented cases of attempted elder financial manipulation she had seen in 20 years. It also included the judge's ruling verbatim, which was public record and didn't need anyone's permission. The television segment aired the following Monday. It used court documents, the bar referral, and an interview with a regional elder law advocate who had statistics that made people put down their coffee cups and pay full attention. Denton's name was not mentioned. However, his license was under review. His firm had received inquiries, and several colleagues had called. He hired his own lawyer, which Aldous found quietly satisfying. Like a load-bearing element placed just right, it meant the structure was finally carrying the weight it was meant to carry. Suki had no comment. Several people noted this, as they had expected one. Britta called on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the hearing. Aldous was in the garden. He let the phone ring twice before answering. Dad, she said. Then she paused, and he could hear her taking a moment to steady herself, focusing on putting her thoughts together. I know, he said. I should have. I know, he replied again. I'm not ready to talk about it yet. Give me some time. A pause. Okay. I'll call you when I am, he said. I keep my word. He didn't know yet what was possible between them. He thought about Britta at 12, following him around the workshop on Saturday mornings, asking questions about every tool and its purpose. She was the only one of his children who wanted to know how things were built. He thought about the woman she had become, who stood in a gallery unable to look at him. He reflected on the distance between those 2 versions of her and whether they could be reconciled. He was an engineer. He had professional opinions about bridges. He thought it might be possible. Not easily. Not soon. But maybe. The house looked the same as it always had. The garden needed some attention after weeks of distraction, but nothing an afternoon couldn't fix. The workshop in the back had a half-finished side table waiting for him since before the hearing, a commission from the family of a young teacher at the local school who had mentioned she always wanted a proper writing desk. He returned to the workshop and picked up where he left off. That was October. By December, 3 elder law organizations contacted him, asking if he would be willing to speak, not publicly and not with his name, but in closed sessions with families and advocates and social workers who needed to see what the pattern looked like from the inside. He agreed to 2 of them. He brought his notebook. He explained, with the careful clarity of someone used to teaching, exactly how a person paying attention can spot when their foundation is being tested. He explained what to do about it. Aldous Fairweather built things. That was what he did. He always had. Some of what he built was concrete and steel. Some was documentation. Some, in the years that followed, was harder to quantify but no less real, the slow, careful process of rebuilding his life on honest terms, with people who deserved to be in it, in a house that was still and always his. They had thought he was finished. They never understood what he was made of. Subscribe to Gray Hair Stories for more tales of people who refuse to be counted out. Like, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and we'll see you in the next one. What does Aldous's story mean to you? Is there someone in your life right now who feels pushed aside, who needs someone to stand with them? Tell me in the comments.